Hello and welcome to the Wright Boiler Company. Today we are going to demonstrate how to find a leak in a Wright boiler, how to plug or replace a tube. Now before we begin, I want to point out this manual right here, which is a water treatment guide to Wright boilers. By following the steps in this guide, you can prevent ever having to replace a tube in a Wright boiler and prevent leaks from occurring. But if that doesn't happen and you do develop a leak, this demonstration is to show you how to repair and replace. Okay, so if you notice water on the floor underneath your boiler, this is how you go about finding where the leak is taking place. First thing you do is you lock out and tag out the boiler. That involves basically turning off the electricity and turning off the gas. That way the boiler can't fire. You let the boiler cool down, and then when you can, you're going to have to gain access to the firebox. Now we have different ways of gaining access to the firebox. On a boiler like this, you're going to be undoing a door that just comes off, that's just held on by 4 wing nuts. On some doors, there's a power burner on there with hinges down the side. You're going to unbolt the hinges and you're going to swing that door open. And on other boilers, there's an access door in the side. But you're basically going to have to gain access into the firebox to look up into the tube bundle to see what's occurring. And once you do that, you're going to be taking a flashlight and looking up at the bottom row of tubes like this and seeing if you can find the leak. Finding a tube leak above the bottom row or the second row is a little more challenging than just seeing it from the bottom of the firebox, but it's still not that difficult. And what all it involves is spraying water in the one end and basically plugging off the tube at this end and building up a little water pressure in each tube and then waiting to see if a leak develops and goes down into the firebox. Once you've done that, you can identify which tube is leaking. So you can either have something like this with expandable tube plug, a 2-inch expandable tube plug, that you move from tube to tube. You just put them in like this, cinch them down like that, or it can be as simple as taking, maybe a rag or a rag with a piece of plastic, pushing it in and holding it here, while someone at the other end is spraying water into the tube. So there would be somebody else in the front there looking up into the tube bundle to see if any water is leaking down when you're performing this test. So once that's noted that water is leaking down from one of the tubes or one or more of the tubes, we would obviously make a mark on a piece of paper or on the tube itself that tube has a leak in it. There are 2 places that a boiler tube can leak. The first place is at the roll joint, which is right here where the tube meets the tube sheet and the tube is expanded into the tube sheet. And the second place is anywhere along the length of the tube that's not at the roll joint. So those are the 2 places that a boiler tube can leak. Now, if you're in the firebox looking, you want to take your flashlight, and if you see water dripping off the bottom of the tube sheet here, there's a good chance that it's leaking at the tube and the tube sheet roll. Okay, it could be anywhere up in this bundle, you don't know that. If it's anywhere in between, then it tells you that it's a leak inside the tube. And the reason that's important to know is because there are 2 different ways to go about fixing a leak like that. The first way, when it comes to the tube sheet roll like this, at the junction where we're leaking here, is to go back in and re-roll that tube. And if we're leaking between the tube sheets, then we're either going to plug that tube or we're going to replace that tube. Tube leaks in the roll joint are rather rare, and that's because the rolling and flaring process is usually so complete and so bulletproof that we're not going to develop leaks. This is an example of a rolled tube, And you're seeing that not only do you have a flared end here, but you also have this expansion all the way through the tube in about 1.25 inch distance. That always extends past the roll joint here. So everything here is gripping to the inside of the tube wall, and a leak there is very rare. Usually the only time you're going to have a leak on something like that is if there's some sort of a crease or some kind of a groove that runs through the tube sheet hole, which is very, very rare, but that would create a leak path. Sometimes when people have cut out tubes and they try to slit across that tube sheet hole to get the tube out, they can damage the tube sheet in that way, and then that causes a permanent leak path. You would have to then go and re-weld that and then die grind it out to get back to a solid hole in there, okay? Far more likely to occur is a leak between the tube sheets. And there are two causes for that. One is lime scale, and the other is oxygen corrosion, or some kind of electrolysis or some kind of corrosion taking place. So the first one I'm going to show you is an extreme case of lime scale. So here's a tube that is full of lime scale, okay? This obviously prevents good heat transfer. And if this tube is in one of the lower rows, what we call the radiant, one of the radiant tubes down here that's seeing the direct heat from the flame, the bottom of the tube is going to get extremely hot, and if water inside is not contacting directly on the other side to take that energy away, the tube overheats and it'll eventually crack and water will leak out. Another reason that tubes leak between the tube sheets would be oxygen corrosion. So here an example of a couple of tubes that have developed pitting from oxygen corrosion. There's one we cut in half, and here's one where you can actually see the holes inside the tubes that have eaten all the way through. So either one of these failure causes, whether it's lime scale or oxygen corrosion, the tube either has to be plugged or replaced. So now that we've shown you how to find a tube leak, we're going to show you how to plug that tube. Now, it's vitally important that that tube have a hole in it. You don't want to plug a tube that doesn't have a hole because it could build up pressure, and even that tube can pop open and explode, really, if you will. So you want to be sure that the tube has a hole in it. If there's any doubt about it, make sure to put a hole in it either with a cutting torch or something like that to make sure that it's got a hole. And then once you've done that, you can plug a tube with simple pipe fittings. The advantage of doing this is you get the boiler right back into service. It gives you time to look at the rest of the tubes and see whether or not you've got a major problem, maybe adjust your water treatment program. You can clean some of the other tubes out with tube cleaning brushes, that type of thing. Make any adjustments you need to, and you're really not going to affect the efficiency of the boiler by taking one or maybe even two tubes out of service. This is 1.5 inches by 2.5 inch long Schedule 40 black pipe nipple. It can be longer than that. It doesn't want to be shorter than that. You do want to have some meat in here, areas where there's no thread, because later on we're going to have to cut that out. We put pipe dope on one end, and we're taking 1.5 inch cap, threaded cap on the other end. We're going to screw that on, sort of as tight as we can go by hand. And then we're going to drive this with a big hammer into this tube right here. We're going to drive it in to the point where the threads are inside the bell and we just see the meat of the tube. Once we've done that, that will seal off that tube. Put some pipe dope on the threads on this end. And we're going to take a different cap this time because we've been beating on this cap. We might have cracked it. So we'll take a brand new cap. Put that on. Take a pipe wrench, Once this tube is plugged at both ends, you've effectively sealed off the tube. So now what I'm going to do is show you how to remove this plug. In the event that later on you go back and you replace some or all the tubes in the boiler. And what it's going to involve is I'm going to take a flame cutting torch and I'm going to cut right along this area of the meat here. We're going to knock off the capped end of the tube, and then we're going to cut a wedge out of what's remaining inside the tube and pull that out.
Be careful not to nick the tube sheet when you're flame cutting.
If we have a tube leak at the junction between the tube and the tube sheet, at the roll joint, as I said before, you're going to see water coming down the tube sheet, and it's going to drip off the end of this header box and down onto the floor. It could be either at the front end of the boiler or it could be at the rear of the boiler. So the important thing is to identify where the general area of the leak is coming from. You know, is it coming from this side, the middle, or this side? If it's coming from this side, what we want to do is we want to concentrate on re-rolling the tubes above here, because we don't necessarily know if it's coming from the bottom tube, the second row up, the third row up, or so on and so forth. So we're going to have to re-roll all the tubes on that side. So basically you just take some tube rolling grease, put it inside the tube, put the expander in like that, put the mandrel in like that, turn it by hand until it gets a little bit tight. And then you can simply take a crescent wrench and begin rolling by hand like this. As the expander goes in, you'll find you'll get more and more resistance, and it gets tighter in there. So you're expanding the tube into the tube sheet. When it starts to get hard and with a lot of resistance, you might want to go 2 or 3 revolutions around by hand, and when you've done that, you'll back it off. When you're all done re-rolling the tubes, we do want to get the tube grease out of the tube. So this is the tube grease. Just take a rag and swipe it around like that inside, and that'll help keep the grease out of the boiler water later on.
When you have to install a new tube, you first put the tube in, and then you have to put a flattened nail or a flat screwdriver in on one side to prevent the tube from spinning when you start to roll it. So here is a tube being pneumatically rolled and expanded in place. This is the first side. The other side has got the nail in it. When we go to roll the other side, we first remove the nails very carefully so we don't leave any pieces of the nail in there, and then we re-roll the second side.
So now we're going to actually cut this tube out that we had the tube plug in, and we're going to demonstrate how to do that. One of the things I've set up here is a little wire rope. And that is so when the tubes are dropping down, they don't come down with a hard bang on top of the firebox floor or on top of the burner bed. It just kind of cradles the tube in here when it falls, and then you can slide the tube out the front firebox door. So one of the important things is to remember is when you flame cut, we're going to do a cut around in the circle from the inside of the tube. We're going to be working on the inside here, and we have to be past the tube sheet. Well, when you cut, so the torch has got to extend beyond that, and always remember that the tube sheet thickness is the same as the flange thickness, which you can measure on the outside. So whatever the flange thickness is, the tube sheet is the same, and you just want to be sure that your cutting tip is cutting past that tube sheet. You don't want to nick the back of the tube sheet. It's not the end of the world if you do, but it's just better if you don't. So after we've cut a tube out, then we have the stubs that are left inside the tube sheet, and we have to knock those out. Now in our tube rolling kit, which we rent out, we have various tools that will help you do that, including the big heavy hammer here. We have some punches like this. And this little device right here, which will give you a little fish mouth here to begin your process of tube removal. So you can use something like this to go in and grab the flare and pull down. And that gives you a place to rest your punch and start knocking the tube in that particular spot. So now you take your punch like this. We're going to put it on the edge of that fish mouth like that, and we're going to start to drive it in. And then once we get it in far enough, we're going to start to change the angle on the punch like this and drive it out of the hole. So this is the stub that we've just driven out of the tube sheet hole. That's where I was hammering and driving it out. Now you can see what taking a tube stub out is like, and you can also understand something, I think, and that is if you were to try to take this tube out without removing the tube and the stub below here, there's no way for the tube to drop down. It can't get past the stub. That's why when you're retubing, you want to work from the bottom up, and then give yourself a fall path and remove these tube stubs each step of the way, and then go up to the next row, the next row, the next row. Now you would leave corner tubes in on the corner. On a big boiler like this, you'd leave one in the middle here to give you some resistance when you're knocking the stubs out. And then when you go to retube the boiler, before you take these defective tubes out, if they were defective or you were replacing them, you would put a new tube here, roll a new tube here, a new tube here, one here, and then you would cut these tubes out. And because the reason you do that is it holds the header boxes in place, they don't move. There are a couple of other things that can happen in a boiler where you want to replace the tubes above the tube, higher up in the tube bundle without taking a lot of the tubes out below. So, for example, in a steam boiler like this, if you lost the tubes above the water line, if they were corroded out, let's say, and you only needed to replace, let's say the top row of tubes here, and then the very top drying row of tubes up here. These are steam drying tubes up here. And let's say you needed to replace one or both those rows. Well, it would be a lot of work to create a fall path and cut all these tubes down here if the only tubes you have replaced were here or here. If that's the case, you can go into the side of the boiler and expose it. We have a removable inner top that comes down on this side that you can move and remove, take it out, and now it's going to expose the tube bundle like this. Now you can go in and actually remove the tubes here, pull the stubs out here, whether you cut from the outside here or you're cutting in through the tube sheet holes from the inside of the header boxes, doesn't really matter. But the point is you can cut the tubes and lift them out here, where these tubes will drop down, and you pull them out here, you can knock the stubs out without disturbing any of the tubes below that. Now, in some extreme cases where you have, going back to having lime scale in the tubes, if you have a lot of lime scale in the tubes like this, sometimes it's necessary to remove the side. Again, the side without the gas train and controls, so you're not disturbing the electrical. You remove the side without the gas train and controls, you have easy access, and now you go in and you would cut Cut the tube from the outside, so you're cutting outside, because you cannot cut through heavy scale. Now, a little bit of scale, you can sometimes take a screwdriver or some other pointed tool and kind of knock the scale as you're going along. If it's very light, a 1/16 of an inch or an 1/8 of an inch, you can kind of knock it out as you're going along. But if you get really heavy scale inside there, it may be necessary to cut the tubes, again, from the outside. And then you would go through your same procedure of knocking the stubs from the inside and knocking them in and then pulling them out. Garden variety rag, hose and a hose gun, pry bar, crowbar, tube expander, mandrel, and an extension. Little bar for tool for fish mouthing the end of a flared tube. Heavy 10-pound hammer, a mini sledgehammer. You can use this as a punch. It's like a piece of a crowbar that you use
When you have a deep header box.
when you're trying to knock the tube stub out. Garden variety pipe wrench. Channel locks just for grabbing something hot. And Schedule 40 nipple, 1.5 by 3.5 inches long. And a pipe cap, 150-pound black malleable.
And an oxyacetylene cutting outfit like this one.
Okay, and this is the top half of the suitcase. If you're going to be doing a full retube and you don't have the equipment, you would probably want to rent this entire thing. This is an electric tube roller right here. This is a die grinder. There's a die grinding stone. This is for touching up the tube sheet holes in case they need a little extra grinding or whatever. You know, you can just touch them up and clean them up with that die grinder right there. We will typically supply the correct tube expander that you need, depending on the tube sheet thickness. So if we know the tube sheet thickness that your boiler has, we provide the correct expander for that. A couple of other, you know, we've got bolt dressing here. We've got the little nails you tap in to keep the tube from rolling when you roll it. And we also have bolt, high temperature anti-seize bolt dressing for the bolts, the head plate bolts when you put those back on. You know, again, various punches, and that's the little tube plug you saw earlier, and that type of thing. Typically in here we've got some taps in case you have to retap the flange. So that's about it. You can we can rent this stuff out if you need it, or you know, or we can just take certain parts out, and you can rent those separately if you're just touching up a tube or replacing a tube or two. You don't really need the whole tube roller. Well, thank you very much for watching. Have a great day.